Great. Thank you very much for putting our paper on this program. I guess one of the only benefits of the situation we're in is the ability to be part of these cross-institutional seminars. So this is joint work with Jen Ho and Andrei Levchenko, who are here and also happy to answer questions as we go along. So as we all know, GDP growth is positively correlated across countries. I have here a picture from the G7 over a period of 40 years, and you can see that there's a lot of heterogeneity, but clear evidence of synchronization. A very large literature has focused on trying to understand why such co-movement in GDP growth arises, and broadly speaking, has focused on two questions. So the first is, does co-movement occur because shocks transmit across countries through trade linkages? Or is it that the shocks that hit countries themselves are correlated or common shocks? The second broad question is, what are the shocks? So are these the technology shocks as going back to the original BKK model, or are these non-technology shocks as in, for instance, Stockman and Teaser? At this point, we still don't have a consensus on these questions. And what we are trying to do in this paper is provide a framework that allows us to give a comprehensive account of international co-movement in GDP. So we're going to in more detail, we're going to proceed in a number of steps. So first, we're going to derive an accounting framework that allows us to express the bilateral correlation in GDP of any pair of countries as the sum of three components. So the first component is due to common shocks or correlated shocks hitting the two countries. The second component is because shocks transmit across between the pair of countries, for instance, through trade linkages. And the third component that we refer to as multilateral effects are because of potentially correlated responses of the countries in question to shocks that occur everywhere else in the world. So we can always decompose co-movement in GDP into these three terms, but this also makes very clear that to actually understand whether correlated shocks or transmission is important for co-movement, we need this is a quantitative question, so we need a model framework to be able to understand this. So we then proceed to build a dynamic multi-country, multi-sector model with production and trade linkages, and use this model to quantify the components of our decomposition. So let me talk briefly about the model. So the model bridges the static propagation in networks literature that is largely closed economy and the dynamic business cycle literature. And some of the benefits of the structure that we're going to set up is that we can cleanly separate the static network block from the dynamic responses to shocks. So we can assess both the intratemporal propagation of shocks through the network and then the delayed propagation that is more the question of interest in the IRBC literature. So we use this framework and we implement our accounting decomposition in it. And we use it to measure the relative importance of correlated shocks versus transmission. And then finally, we try to make some progress in the second question, which is, what are the shocks? So of course, we cannot identify every single candidate shock that people have proposed for explaining co-movement in our multi-country model. But what we can do to make progress in the question of what are the most promising shocks is to conduct an international business cycle accounting exercise. So what we do here is infer the contributions of a number of wedges. So we infer the contributions of the TFP wedge, the labor wedge, a capital wedge, and an intermediate input wedge. And this provides insight into what candidate shocks are more promising for generating international movement. So what do we find? We find in our first, I'm going to begin by showing you the static network model and then add on the dynamics. So my first findings are going to be about the static network model. And what we find there in our preferred calibration is that the bulk of co-movement comes out of correlated shocks. So in fact, for the G7, about 4/5 of co-movement is due to shock correlation and only about 1/5 to transmission. For our full country sample, it's about 25% transmission, but still we need correlated shocks to really account for the majority of co-movement. We dig into this result a little bit deeper. We try to understand the mechanisms in our model. We perform a number of comparative statics, and these give us some unexpected insights in some instances. For instance, we look at the role of trade costs, and to do this, we shift the economy towards autarky, and we find actually that somewhat unexpected that shifting the economy towards autarky can actually amplify the role of shock correlation, because in equilibrium, it can lead to more correlated sectors expanding. So in that sense, autarky could actually imply that economies are more correlated. We then dig into the role of the production network. So we shut down trade and intermediate inputs, and we find that the model without input trade understates co-movement by about 17 to 22%. Finally, the static network model that I'm going to show you, which is the first part of this talk, is going to have an analytical solution, and that solution is going to rely just on three elasticities and some input-output data that can be easily measured. And so we also assess the sensitivity of our results to the elasticities that we need for the solution. And we find that if we go to extremes, so we make the labor supply elasticity very high and the substitution elasticity and the production function very low, we can, as expected, increase the role of transmission. We can get transmission to be about half of co-movement, but it still does not account for all of co-movement. Finally, we then turn to the role of dynamics, so the propagation of shocks intertemporally. And I'm going to show you in detail that this is very cleanly separable in our framework. So once we add on dynamics, we find that dynamics do contribute to co-movement. They have a modest positive contribution to co-movement, but the bulk of co-movement comes from the impact responses of shocks to shocks. And also, when we go to dynamics, the overall insight in the role of correlated shocks versus transmission does not change. So that's the first group of findings. In the second group of findings, we try to understand what shocks could be responsible for co-movement. And as I already mentioned here, we do an international business cycle accounting exercise. So we match value-added labor, capital, intermediate input series using a TFP wedge, a labor wedge, an intermediate input wedge, and investment wedge. And then we assess the contributions of each of these wedges for co-movement. And we find that overall, removing the labor wedge appears to affect GDP co-movement the most. So when we remove the labor wedge, co-movement drops by a little bit more than half. The other wedges vary in importance. The TFP wedge is the second most important. If you remove it, co-movement drops by about 30%. We also find that when you have just the TFP wedge and the labor wedge, you can jointly account for almost all of co-movement and produce GDP series that are very similar to the data. We view this as a positive result because these two wedges are extracted from simple intratemporal equations in the model, and they operate very similarly both in the static network model and in the full dynamic model. And so the simplicity of these two wedges and the fact that they jointly account for most co-movement, we view as something that is positive for these models. Okay, so there's a very large literature naturally that we're building on. And because this is a short talk, I'm going to skip going into details here. But again, our focus here is really to bridge the closed economy network propagation literature, so largely closed economy, that has studied the intratemporal propagation of shocks through the production network with the international business cycle literature that has been studying the propagation of shocks through time.
Nitya, can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
Just like in terms of fitting the paper in the literature, so a lot of the international business cycle literature has been about not only about GDP, but about the correlation of consumption versus GDP, the cyclicality of the trade balance, real exchange rates versus consumption. So you're going to be looking at one moment, which is GDP correlation, right? In terms of these counterfactuals.
Exactly.
Is there any reason? I mean, your model is equipped. You're equipped to look at employment, investment, not the trade balance because you're going to have financial autarky. But is there any reason why you only focus on GDP?
So we're going to. No, well, we started out, this is just a question of the history of the project, and we started out trying to understand the role of co-movement for GDP. But particularly in the latter part of the exercise where we exactly fit, for instance, hours and so on.
Right, but you could ask the question, what's the role of networks for the correlation of hours or for the correlation of consumption?
Yes, and these are, we can look at what the model says about that. We haven't computed all of this, we could do it. One thing that we have done is looked at how well the model does in terms of the standard deviation of GDP. We come to the international business cycle accounting exercise, but yes, our model, we can compute all these other moments in there as well. But as you said, financial autarky, so no trade balance, but yes, thank you. Okay, so let me begin by going into now the accounting framework, which is the first step of this process. And so I'm going to here express gross output. So I'm going to bring in some notation now. Gross output in sector J, country N, Y and J is produced with a bundle of primary factors I and intermediate inputs X and J. And the intermediate inputs can potentially come from all countries and sectors in the world. And here we're also going to make clear that theta is the vector of shocks, and the supply of inputs and primary factors is subject to shocks that or can be affected by shocks that again occur in any country in any set in the world. Okay, so with this definition for gross output, I can then define real GDP in country N, which is total value added, Vn, which is the sum over all sectors J in that country of gross output evaluated at base prices, less the usage of intermediate inputs, also evaluated at some base prices. Okay, so here I'm not putting any more structure. This is just a definition of GDP. I'm not going to put any structure on, for instance, the functional form of the production function. And this is on purpose. We want this to be as general as possible. So with that, we can then express the first order approximation to the log change in GDP as the sum of all of the shocks that occur in every country and sector in the world, theta mi, multiplied by the general equilibrium elasticity of country N's GDP with respect to the shock that originates in country M sector I. Okay, so these GE elasticities in the networks literature have been referred to as influence vectors, which pick up the response of GDP to shocks that originate in a particular sector. So here what we're doing is expanding this to the open economy, and our influence vector is now going to include the general equilibrium elasticities for a country with respect to shocks that occur in any country and sector in the world. And these are going to be these terms S. Without further structure, I cannot say what these S's are. These are equilibrium objects, and they're going to depend on the context of the model that you're operating in. Okay, but this is going to always be true. And this first order approximation is still useful even without further structure, because it allows me to then provide a very intuitive way of understanding co-movement between a pair of countries. So I'm going to now think about some pair of countries, NNM, so you can think of the US and Canada, and I'm going to break down the US's GDP growth into three components. So the first component is going to be the US's response to its own shocks. In all the US sectors, is going to be the direct effect. And naturally, those are going to be GE elasticities that refer to the US's response to its own shocks. The US is also going to be responding to shocks that occur in Canada. So this is the partner effect. And finally, the US is responding to shocks that occur everywhere else in the world. So this is the third country effect. When I do this decomposition, I can then easily express the covariance in GDP growth between the US and Canada as the sum of three components. So the first component is going to be because the shocks that hit the US and Canada, or the pair of countries in question, themselves are correlated. As you can very clearly see from here, so this is the covariance coming from the shock correlation term. The second is going to be bilateral transmission. So there's going to be correlation coming from the fact that Canada responds to shocks in the US, and that is correlated with the US's response to shocks in the US and vice versa. And finally, there are going to be the multilateral effects. So in this instance, the US and Canada are both responding to shocks that occur everywhere else in the world, and that can generate correlation in their GDP. Okay, so once I have this decomposition, it makes very clear, it provides a clear way to think about how to understand bilateral co-movement. So it also makes very clear that to proceed further, to understand co-movement and whether it is correlated shocks or transmission, this is going to be a quantitative question. I'm going to need a model framework, and I'm going to, in fact, need to do a bunch of, make a few steps. So the first is I need some shocks. I need to measure some thetas that I can use to answer this question. Finally, then second, I'm going to need to have a model structure that gives me information on what the influence matrix or the influence vector is. And in particular here, we're going to have an IRBC model with the global production network that gives me the GE elasticities that I need for the influence matrix. And finally, I'm going to need to then think about what the appropriate counterfactual is. And in particular, for instance, you might think that we want to see what would happen to understand the role of the production network if we shut down intermediate trade, or to understand the role of trade costs if we want to move to autarky. And this process makes very clear that then we need to think about what the appropriate general equilibrium elasticities are going to be in these alternative counterfactual scenarios, given the shocks. Okay, for instance, with no intermediate trade, you can imagine there's an alternative GE elasticity, which I'm calling SF. Or if I'm in autarky, you can imagine there's an alternative GE elasticity, which is going to be 0 if M is not equal to N, because in autarky, the country does not respond to foreign shocks. Okay, there's no transmission. So this is what we're going to do to now make progress. And the next step then naturally is to set up this model. And again, we're going to do one model, but you can think about other models where you can implement the same decomposition. Okay? The decomposition is going to still be useful to understand the role of correlated shocks versus transmission, provide a framework for understanding co-movement.
One clarifying comment is, so I think you're making the right, I think, based on an assumption that you're going to assume that the shocks, the structure of the shocks will be unchanged when you move, say, to autarky. Now that's like the work by Andre and Javier, or your own work, where basically when you have, like, if you think about shocks being correlated to multinationals, for example, or trade acts as a way to link productivity across countries, that you're not gonna take that into account, which I think is a right starting point, but just to
yeah, no, and actually that's fair, and we clarify this in the paper too. So we are not we're not taking into account that, for instance, the presence of input trade might lead to endogenously more correlated shocks, and then there will be a different situation in autarky. But that you could consider that is also something we need to think about. It's just we're not doing it right now. Okay, so let me go into the model. I think I might be talking too fast. I'm sorry about that. I'm just trying to I'm trying to keep track of time, but I'll slow down a little bit now. I think I was going a little too fast. Okay, so let me walk you through the model. So we're going to have 30 sectors indexed by J and I, and 29 countries indexed by N, M, and K. And now I'm going to posit a specific functional form for sectoral production, which is going to be Cobb-Douglas. The sector is going to experience a TFP shock, Z and J. This is going to be the only shock for now. You can think of it more as a composite supply shock, and I'll discuss that more in a little while. And is going to produce using a bundle of intermediate inputs, X and J, and then capital and labor. To begin with, we're going to start with just a static network setting. We're going to assume that the capital stock is fixed for now, but we're going to relax that and allow the capital stock to evolve in the second part of the paper. The Armington, so the intermediate goods trade bundle is going to be Armington, and the elasticity is going to be epsilon. So the input bundle uses inputs from all countries and sectors in the world. And I highlight the epsilon here in red because this is going to be one of the 3 key elasticities we need to solve the model. Okay, so we're going to also assume that trade costs are iceberg. On the household side, households are going to consume a final consumption bundle F and supply labor to all sectors. So one thing to notice here is we're going to have sector-specific labor supply. We're going to assume GHH preferences with a Frisch elasticity psi. And again, we do this, so labor supply is not fully fixed in a sector, but not fully flexible. It's going to be upward sloping. And I'm highlighting psi in red because again here, that's going to be the second key elasticity that we need in the solution of the model. Okay, and if we make labor supply completely inelastic, we will be similar to some of the other network models in the literature, and I'll talk about that as well when I show you the solution. The final goods bundle F is going to also be an Armington aggregate of final goods from the whole world, and that the elasticity in that aggregator rho is going to be the third key elasticity that we need for the solution. And that's it, we only need these 3 elasticities. And we're also going to assume, as Ariel already pointed out, that we are in financial autarky. So this is for a number of reasons. So first, Heathcote and Perry have already pointed out that models with financial autarky do a better job of matching, delivering co-movement. But also here, the advantage of financial autarky is that it's going to allow us to have an analytical solution for the static network block and provide a lot of transparency into our results. Okay, so we could, for instance, relax this assumption, but then we would lose the analytical solution and the transparency. And so we think that this is a good place to start. Okay, so let me talk now about, and then finally to conclude the model, there's also market clearing, of course. So output in each sector is sold for final consumption to all countries in the world and for use as intermediate inputs in all countries and sectors in the world. And I'm going to highlight some other objects here. So these pi F and pi X are going to be shares. So this is the share of spending of country M on country N sector J goods in final consumption, and analogously for input consumption, for input usage. Okay, so these shares are easily obtained from any IO data. And finally, we're going to, of course, have a trade balance condition as well. Okay, so that's the model. That's a static model. And we can then solve it analytically. So this is part of the benefit of the structure we have. We, in general, for these types of open economy models, you cannot obtain an exact analytical solution. But in our case, we can obtain an analytical solution to the first order approximation of the model. And so here, I'm going to walk you through that. That's going to be one of the main contributions of this part. So we can express the vector of sectoral output, log y, as a matrix lambda, which is going to be the influence matrix, times the vector of TFP shocks in all countries and sectors in the world. And this matrix lambda, while it looks complicated, has the advantage that it actually contains only objects that are easily measured, or our 3 key elasticities that I've already been talking about. Okay, so in particular, if you look at it, these matrices pi f and pi x are just matrices that collect all of the final goods shares and the input shares that I already showed you. And then the matrix P here encodes the response of prices to the shocks, prices worldwide to the shocks, and is itself also just a function of, again, these observed share matrices and the 3 key elasticities. Okay, so even though it looks complicated, the advantage of this, this approach is that we can easily construct this influence matrix from observables in the data and 3 structural parameters, and we can then solve the model. We don't need to specify anything else about the model. I will also point out that this influence matrix here looks like a Leontief inverse, but it is not a Leontief inverse matrix. So for those of you who are familiar with the closed economy network propagation literature, you will be aware that you know, those models can sometimes have a Leontief inverse influence matrix. Ours deviates from the Leontief inverse because first, we're not assuming unitary elasticity of substitution. So, you know, we don't have, we can allow for the epsilon and rho to not be 1, but also because we're allowing for elastic factor supply. Okay, so we are not assuming that psi is chosen such that factor supply is inelastic. Okay, so this is the influence matrix. We can then also express the change in the vector of hours worldwide as the primitive shocks times the influence matrix times some other objects that are also easily measured. And finally, what we care about, this is sectoral output, we care about value added. So we can also express the vector of value added as the sector's TFP shock, as the TFP shocks plus alpha times the change in hours. And again, because change in hours themselves are related to the TFP shocks that are happening everywhere in the world through the influence matrix, the change in value added is related to the change, is related to the shocks that are happening everywhere else in the world. What this also makes very clear is that if we assumed, so the sector responds to its own TFP, and then it responds more than just to its own TFP because it can also change its usage of labor. And the response of labor is going to depend on the shocks that are occurring everywhere in the world, right, through the influence matrix. So if we were to assume that labor supply was inelastic, then all of the response of value added would be only to own TFP. So there would be no transmission of the shocks across countries, right? And then by construction, so this is the case that is analyzed in many of the network models. But by construction in this situation, because there's no transmission, all of GDP co-movement has to be because of correlated shocks. Okay, so we view the allowing labor supply to be elastic as being a more reasonable assumption for a business cycle model. Okay, so now let me talk about the quantification.
Nitya, one comment about that. So just that result is if you have like monopolistic competition, if you have any wedges, which you don't have, everything is perfectly competitive, then you could have a first order effects of foreign shocks on domestic value added, right? Just, right?
Yeah.
That's the only place where this assumption plays a role. Even constant markups, right? For measured GDP, if you have even constant markups different to 0, then foreign productivity shocks, say, can affect the domestic TFP.
Right. Here, yeah. Here we're just making a comparison implicitly to, for instance, the main result in Baka and Fahi, right? That yeah. But again, it's not assuming it's all with perfect competition. Yeah.
Yeah. No, just that's the only place I think where this assumption of zero markups plays a role.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's a fair point, and yeah, I should have said that. But thank you. Okay. So let me continue with the quantification of the static model. So we need to compute the influence matrix. We need a little bit of data, but again, everything is readily measured. So we need an IO matrix. We get that from WIOD. We need series for gross output, value add, and price indices. Clem's has the longest data set here. So we use Clem's data, and we end up with 29 countries and 30 sectors that cover the whole economy, and an unbalanced panel that goes from 1970 to 2007. Okay, and broadly speaking, for the G7 countries, we tend to have long time series. For developing countries, we have a much shorter time series. We also need to calibrate the three elasticities that go into the influence matrix. So we estimate them within, in the paper. I won't talk about that here, but we calibrate rho in the baseline to 2.75, epsilon to 1, and the fringe elasticity to 2. But of course, I'm going to show you sensitivity with respect to these parameters. Okay, and then we need some other data, for instance, the labor and capital shares. We get all of that from Clem's. Okay, so what do we do next? So I already mentioned that, we need a model to tell us what the influence matrix is. I've walked you through how we get the influence matrix within the framework of our model and how we will actually measure it using objects in the data and a few parameters. And the next thing we need, of course, are the shocks, right? And there are two ways to proceed. You could either have some shocks that have been estimated elsewhere and assess how they, what they imply in our framework. Alternatively, what we can do here is, and what we will do in this paper is say that, well, the vector value added can be expressed as the TFP shocks times the scaling factor plus the change in hours times alpha. And we know that the change in hours is a function of the influence matrix. So we can then invert this expression and choose the TFP shocks to match sector value added, and then look at the properties of the shocks that we're backing up. Okay, and again here, I'm calling these TFP shocks, but you should view them really as a composite supply shock, because as Baka and Faye have already pointed out, in this type of setting, factor supply shocks will be isomorphic to TFP shocks. Okay, so this is really more of a composite supply shock. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to back out shocks that exactly match sector value added. And then we're going to compute country and GDP as the sum of its TFP shocks, DOMA weighted, plus the transmission term that comes through change in hours in the country in response to the shocks everywhere in the world. Okay, so before I show you what the shocks we back out and our model implies for co-movement and transmission, let me begin by showing you a little bit some of the mechanisms in the model. Okay, so before we feed in the actual shocks we've backed out, we start by thinking about some artificial shocks just to understand how propagation is working in the model. So the first exercise we do is simulate the model with a 1% US shock in all sectors. And the idea here is to look at the response of all partner countries to this US shock. Okay, and and you will see that there is transmission in the model. It operates the way that you would think. Economies that have large trade linkages with the US, like Canada, respond the strongest, and large countries like Japan respond much less. Okay, so this is exactly what we would think when we see this type of shock, or we would expect. The second exercise we do is then feed in a rest of the world shock in all sectors. So the idea here is for each country, we assume that the country itself is not shocked, but all of its partner countries experience a shock. Okay, and how does that shock propagate to the country in question that is not shocked? So we do this exercise country by country. And again, you can see substantial transmission. So big countries like the US and Japan are less affected by the foreign shock, the rest of the world shock. But small countries like Estonia or Latvia are very affected by the foreign shock. Okay, so again, propagation exists in the model and it's operating exactly the way that we think it should intuitively in this model. So having said that, we then take our backed out shocks and feed them back into the model and then perform our full accounting decomposition to assess whether it is the transmission that we just saw exists, or is it correlated shocks that actually generate co-movement. And we find that when we do that, shock correlation accounts for most of the co-movement that we see in the data. Okay, transmission for the G7 is only about 1/5 if you add bilateral, multilateral transmission. And for the full country sample, it's about 25%. Okay, so the vast majority of co-movement is coming out of correlated shocks. I can also show you this using some plots to visualize this better. So for instance, if you look at the correlation of GDP growth between any pair of G7 countries, that is this top panel here, you can see that there's a lot of heterogeneity. Thicker lines indicate more correlation, and blue is positive and red is negative. So there's some countries that are negatively correlated, some countries that are positively correlated, and a lot of heterogeneity. And then I can decompose this correlation into the three components in my accounting decomposition. And again, the scale of the lines is the same across all of the plots. Okay, so you also get a sense of the magnitude. And what you can see is the transmission terms, direct and multilateral, are always positive. The only thing is that they're very small. Okay, the shock correlation term, on the other hand, is much bigger and can also be negative, ending up with the accounting for the negative that we see on occasion in the overall movement. Okay, so to look a little bit more at exactly what is going on and to look into our influence matrix further, we also construct heat maps. So you might have seen some of these before. Particularly the one on the left is the heat map of the WIOD of the IO data. So this is something that shows up on occasion. What we have on the y-axis are the using country sectors. I'm not labeling the sectors because there's too many. And on the x-axis are the used country sectors. And you can see that it's block diagonal. So it's very dark on the diagonal. And this is just reflecting that most countries are using very intensively their domestic inputs. Okay, but of course, there's also usage of inputs from other countries. For instance, Canada is buying a lot of US inputs. We can do something similar for the final shares. And again, it's got diagonal because again, it's mostly domestic sectors that are being consumed in final good in the final good aggregator. But we then move on. We can combine these are both inputs into our influence matrix. But if I show you then the heat map of the influence matrix, it looks quite different. In particular, you can see again that the diagonal is important. So the domestic sectors definitely have the biggest influence. But you can also see that there are negatives. So if you look at these lines running parallel to the diagonal, this is the use of the same sector in another country, and that can actually have a negative effect. So a shock to the same sector in another country can have a negative effect on the sector in the using country. Okay, and that you cannot get just out of the heat maps of the WIOD or the final goods consumption. And finally, the last panel shows you the correlation of shocks. And here you can see that actually you don't see anything on the diagonal. So this is just very heterogeneous, and shocks are correlated between pairs of country sectors everywhere. So there's nothing that is really weighting the diagonals. These are the elements that go into actually our final result. Okay. Okay, so now let me show you some comparative statics. Let me begin again. So the influence matrix used these shares that I just showed you the heat maps of, and 3 elasticities. And everything I showed you so far was using our baseline calibration. But now we're going to start to vary these elasticities and also think about the role of the production network that we're feeding into the model. So beginning with elasticities, we recompute the model under different elasticity combinations. So we back out the shocks each time because the shocks depend on the influence matrix. And then we implement our decomposition to look at the role of transmission versus correlated shocks. Okay, and the left side is the G7, the right side is all countries. And what you can see is that in the most extreme case, so these are the blue lines, where we have a low epsilon, so a low intermediate input elasticity of 0.5, a low elasticity in the final goods aggregator of 1, and a very high fresh elasticity, we can get transmission to be about half of total co-movement, okay? But it's not accounting for all total co-movement. The next thing we do is then think about the role of trade costs and the input network. And so here we begin by showing you the autarky comparative statics exercise. And what I'm going to do here is really think about what the difference in co-movement, the counterfactual co-movement between the pair of countries would be in autarky by expressing the difference in co-movement between the pair of countries between autarky and trade. Okay, and I've already shown you that transmission exists in the model. It's positive. It's not very big, but it's there. So absent any other changes, transmission will be increasing co-movement as you move from autarky to trade. So you get these transmission terms. But what should also be clear by this point is that if you move from autarky to trade, you change the structure of the economy, and so you're also going to change the influence matrix. Okay, so I shut down input trade, shut down final goods trade. I changed the relative size of domestic sectors because I start changing my input usage from the domestic sectors. In particular, these influence vectors in autarky will be different from the influence vectors in trade, and that difference could go in either direction. Okay, so this could imply that we amplify the role of more correlated sectors internationally as we go to autarky, and so that can actually offset potentially the increase in co-movement due to transmission as we move from autarky to trade. So let me just show you the results there, since I think so. I'm supposed to finish at 12:20. Is that right? Sorry, I mean, I'm in Central Time, but yes.
Yeah, you have about 13 more minutes.
Okay, so then let me show you the results, and what you can see here. So a positive bar. Yeah.
Well, can you say a word about how you pick this elasticity epsilon, which is super important, right, in terms of how this matrix will change when you change like trade costs? And so you have a little discussion at the end in the appendix. Mm-hmm. You didn't talk much about it, but it seems like. Do
you mean how we estimated?
Yeah, I mean, because if you go back a couple of slides, epsilon does play a role, like going from 1.5 to 0.5.
Yeah.
So you might want to say a word about, I mean, how much do we take seriously this implication of how these shares change when you change?
So I mean, we estimate epsilon in the paper. So this is in the appendix, as I didn't talk about, but we're estimating it based on a regression of relative shares on relative prices with an instrument. Okay, and we get a baseline estimate of 1. That said, there are many estimates, including in a previous paper that I have of the elastic substitution in an input bundle, and at business cycle frequencies, the estimates tend to be pretty low. Okay, so I guess we're using our estimate as the baseline, which is 1, but it's well known that if you have a lower elasticity, you do get more transmission. Okay, so when inputs are complements, you get more transmission. That's exactly what we're seeing here. So as we lower epsilon to say 0.5, which is more consistent with one of my previous papers, we do get more transmission. And as we raise epsilon, it is important, it decreases transmission. Okay, so that's the, okay, so going back to the decomposition of what happens as we move from autarky to trade. So here, the blue bars are showing you the change in total correlation as you go from autarky to trade. So positive implies that the country on average is more correlated with its partners in trade than in autarky. And for most countries, they are more correlated in the actual quantitative, they are actually more correlated in trade than autarky. But what you can see is that if you decompose this change, the pink bars are showing you the role of the change in shock correlation, and the brown bars are showing you the transmission. So transmission by and large is positive. It is contributing to an increase in co-movement as you go from autarky to trade. But for many of the countries, in fact, for more than half the countries, the shock correlation term actually goes the other way. Okay, so what this is saying is that for many countries, if you go to autarky, you actually amplify the role of sectors that have more correlated shocks across countries. Okay. Okay, so that's the role of trade costs. We then also think about just the role of the production network, where we shut down only input trade, but we allow final goods trade. And again, we do this for all of the different elasticity combinations that we have seen that I showed you already. And you can see that across all calibrations, the model without production networks actually underpredicts co-movement by as much as about 70 to 22% in the more extreme cases. Okay, so it appears that final goods trade alone is not enough for generating co-movement. We have a number of other comparative statistics in the paper. I'm not going to talk about all of them here, but we do some other exercises in the paper as well. But instead, what I'm going to do is say that now we're going to it seems that what we find is really that we do need, at least in this framework, in this production networks model, we do need correlated shocks to generate comovement. Okay, so under most reasonable calibrations. Transmission is not accounting for the majority of comovement. So the next thing we're going to do is now make progress on the next question, which is what are the shocks that drive comovement? And to do that, we're going to do a business cycle accounting exercise in the open economy. And in particular, what we're going to do, as I've already mentioned, is choose wedges to match the solar residual. To match value added labor, capital, and media input series. And so essentially, we're going to have an efficiency wedge, a labor wedge, an investment wedge, and an input wedge, and then gauge the importance of each of these different wedges. Let me show you very briefly. So I only have about 8 minutes left. So let me show you very briefly how we get the wedges and then their roles. So we model the wedges as distortive taxes. This is similar to Charity or McGrattan. So we're going to have the TFP wedge. Here I'm renaming Z psi Z because now it's really the efficiency wedge. It's not a composite supply shock anymore. It's going to be in the production function. The input wedge is going to be a tax on the firm's purchase of inputs, and we obtain it from the first order condition for inputs. And then in the household problem, we're going to modify it so that now the household is consuming and investing in each sector. Capital is being accumulated, and there's going to be an investment wedge in the household investment, and a tax on wages on its labor income. So that's going to be the labor wedge. Okay, and we can obtain the labor wedge also from the labor supply condition of the household. So again, this is intratemporal and it's straightforward. But for the investment wedge shows up in the Euler equation, and we need to solve the full dynamic model to obtain the investment wedge. Okay, so this is more complicated. So we do this. I'm not going to talk about how we solve the model, but again, the details of this are in the paper. So we do this, we back out the 4 wedges, and then we do a series of exercises to understand their roles for comovement. But before I get there, let me first show you. So the decompositions I showed you earlier were about correlated shocks and transmission in the static model. Let me briefly just show you that when I go to the dynamic model, the baseline conclusions that I need correlated shocks is not really changing. Okay, so if I implement the decomposition in the dynamic model, again, about 2/3 of comovement ends up being shock correlation, and only about 1/3 is transmission. Okay, so again, we have a lot more detail in the paper that talks about the role of how shocks propagate in the model. In fact, our model delivers impulse response functions with respect to foreign shocks that are what you would expect when you do these types of exercises in an IBC model. It just ends up that quantitatively, the response of economies to their own shocks on impact dominates the overall comovement. Okay, and I think I might not have mentioned one thing about this framework is that the static networks model that I showed you to begin with is the impact response to shocks in the full dynamic model as well. Okay, so the static network model is giving us the impact response. The dynamic model is just adding on to that. And that impact response captured by the static networks model is accounting for most of comovement. Okay, so let me move on to then thinking about which wedge is important in accounting for comovement. So to do this, I'm going to first, I'm going to drop one wedge at a time and then recompute the model. And it turns out that if we drop the labor wedge, comovement decreases by over half. Okay, and the second most important wedge is the TFP wedge, where comovement decreases by 30%. These wedges are not orthogonal to each other, so they can be correlated across countries. The TFP wedge in one country can be correlated with the labor wedge in another country. This is always going to be true in these types of business cycle accounting exercises. So it turns out that if we put in only the TFP shock or only the labor shock, by themselves, they don't generate that much comovement. Okay, on the other, if we put the TFP and the labor shock together, we actually get about 2/3 of the comovement in the data, and we end up with GDP series that are pretty highly correlated with the data. Okay, and we view this as a positive result because again, these two wedges can be extracted from intratemporal optimality conditions in the model. We don't need to solve the full dynamic model to obtain these wedges, and they operate the same way in the static block of the model and dynamic block of the model. And so the fact that just having them generates a lot of 2/3 of Comovement and GDP that is close to the data makes it much simpler to understand, potentially understand Comovement. Okay, so I think I am basically almost out of time, but what we're trying to do in this paper is think about two questions that the literature on understanding GDP Comovement has been thinking about. So in particular, we wanted to understand whether Comovement occurs because shocks are correlated or because of transmission across countries. And we find that at least in when you think about propagation of shocks through networks, through trade linkages, we need correlated shocks to account for Comovement. Transmission is positive, but it's probably the minority of overall Comovement, at least in this type of framework. In terms of what are the shocks, the technology versus non-technology shock question, we find that the TFP wedge itself is not enough to generate a lot of correlation across countries. The labor wedge overall seems most important, but combining these two, which is relatively simple to do in a simple framework, can generate Comovement that is very close to the data. So externally identified shocks that show up as the labor wedge are very promising for understanding international Comovement. And finally, we were thinking throughout here of transmission through production networks and trade linkages. We abstracted from financial linkages, but when we think about the role of production networks, it does appear that they are important for Comovement. It's just that they cannot generate enough transmission to deliver all of Comovement coming out of transmission of shocks. Okay, I think that's it. So I think I'm just on time.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nitya. So now we're going to move to the question and answer section. If you have any questions, you can submit them through the Q&A on the Zoom, through the Zoom, or raise your hand and I will unmute you and call on you. I guess I can kick off with a question here. So you showed a lot of graphs and pictures about thinking about correlations across countries. I was wondering if you guys have used this framework at all to think about which sectors and shocks to which sectors are actually driving a lot of the co-movements. Of course, there's the first order effect is which sectors are going to be largest in terms of shares. But I was wondering if you have anything to say about whether there's more correlation in particular sectors to the shocks or this sort of thing.
Yes, definitely. So I just want to mention also my co-authors are here, and so they should also feel free, of course, to jump in and answer. We can compute an accounting decomposition similar to the one I showed you, but thinking about the role of different sectors. And we have done this. It is in the appendix of the paper, and we find that broadly speaking, services sectors like financial services tend to be the most important for co-movement. Okay, for the non-G7, that also includes sectors like construction, which are also important for co-movement, but for the G7, financial services, and I think wholesale trade are two of the most important sectors for co-movement overall. What is also interesting is that as we go from autarky to trade, these sectors actually decrease in influence for most countries. Okay, so they have the most correlated shocks, but they also decrease in influence for many countries. So that is partly where they would be even more influential in the autarky world, and they would increase co-movement even further.
Okay, so we have a question here from the Q&A. It says, how much do you think that the result changes if you deviate from Cobb-Douglas production function by fixing input shares?
So we vary epsilon. So we don't necessarily, part of the elasticities plot that I was showing you, allowed for epsilon in the input bundle to not be 1. So, transmission does increase if you decrease the elasticity substitution between inputs. Transmission does increase, sorry. But, again, in the most extreme cases that we saw, where we made epsilon 0.5 and we made labor supply very elastic, we still ended up with transmission that was maybe about half of total co-movement, but not all of it. Ariel has a question.
Go ahead, Ariel.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry for that. I think it will be an interesting discussion to have here. Would be like, so there's some people in the audience here that have thought a lot about like UIP shocks or shocks to demand for assets as key drivers for, say, exchange rates, capital flows, etc. And then this is kind of there's a bit of a kind of the disconnect. The question is, how much do these shocks matter for the real economy? In your paper, you have completely abstracted from these things. So it will be interesting to see, like, from the people that argue that those shocks are important, are they only important for the exchange rate, or you think that there's some important link missing from those shocks to the real variables like GDP?
So the spirit of the exercise that we have here is very much how far can we push the model with just the trade linkages, but as you're completely right that we're completely abstracting from all types of financial linkages, right? And that could maybe explain part of the correlated shocks part. Again, we're not doing this really just because we would lose the transparency that we have here with the solution, but I mean, it's definitely plausibly important for Comovement, right? And maybe my co-authors want to say something about this also.
I just want to add something simple, which is just lessons from closed economy. We know that say financial can manifest themselves as say labor wedge or efficient wedge. So here we say that labor wedge is very important, and potentially all these financial linkages, financial frictions, maybe like part of them will show up eventually as a labor wedge. That's something like we can see. But suppose to fully answer your question, we have to somehow build a model. Let's say start with either complete markets or some kind of like a limited asset structure. And exactly what is the right benchmark to use to answer a question is not super clear. Mm-hmm. So we start from financial hierarchy, and we can also go to the other kind of extreme, which is complete markets, but like exactly which is the starting point, something like we can discuss further, I guess. Mm-hmm.
So can I ask a question? So very interesting, and I have a question related to Ariel's point. So it seems like you do this wage accounting very much in the spirit of Charity-Humagratin, right? You focus on quantities and values, but you don't really look much at the prices, right? And I guess this is where exchange rates and terms of trade, they might play some role. So I wonder whether you can also match, let's say, terms of trade, probably the most direct price for your exercise, right? Something like that. So have you looked at that? Do you have any thoughts how well the model can match these moments?
So we have, I mean, you're exactly right that we've solved out, when we do the business cycle accounting, we're solving out for prices everywhere, right? So it's all in terms of values and quantities. But so we have, the short answer is no, we have not looked at that, whether the model is doing a reasonable job of matching prices or not. Could we? Probably, but yeah, we have not done it. So
it would be interesting, right, also to think whether the prices are allocative or not. So how to think about the model which can match well the quantities but not prices. So I guess that's an interesting thing to discuss.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, we could. I mean, I guess we could, but we have not done it. Jen, I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yeah, just like so that's a good question, but I think it's a little bit beyond the scope of this paper, because we know that you need like all kinds of frictions to sort of like addressing simultaneous quantity and the prices, like imperfect pass-through, for example. And if we build all of this about the whistles within the model, potentially we may be able to also, I think, other wedges potentially can simultaneously matching both quantity and the wedges, but it's definitely beyond the scope of the current paper.
But I mean, it's interesting. We could think about it, just not maybe in this paper. Yeah.
But Dimitri, so coming back to your answer, so I thought that in your paper with Oleg that you have all kind of wedges, including other wedges. I thought that you claimed that for real GDP and for like aggregates, those shocks in your model are not that important as say TFP shocks, right? Or is that not?
Yeah, exactly. No, that's why I'm asking. I mean, it seems like, yeah, that can be the case, right? Especially if you have relatively closed economies, but yeah. Whether there are some amplifications when you have this complicated network, that's I guess my question.
Right.
I guess quickly coming to talking about these amplifications. So you briefly said that you're using the first order approximation to solve this. I know that there's some discussions about the higher order approximations actually mattering here. How do you think about that in the context of your results?
So we've exhaustively explored this. In our case, the first order approximation is very good. In the appendix of the paper, we actually have, and maybe I even had it because I was anticipating perhaps this question was going to show up. We have a number of plots showing you when the first order approximation is good and when it's not. And basically what we're doing is varying the shock sizes and how correlated the shocks are, and then assessing, we can compute the exact solution to the static model using the hat algebra approach and compare that to the linear approximation. And we can look at when the approximation is bad, okay? And so what I'm showing you here is just basically varying what the shock sizes are and how correlated they are. And the lines very quickly are kind of the relevant range of shocks. So the range of shocks that we actually have when we implement the model and back out the shocks. And you can see that there are cases where you can get a big difference between the model solution and the first order approximation, but it's never in the range of shocks that we're actually working with is never close to this region. Okay, so you need really, really extreme, very, very big shocks for there to be actually a big difference between the first order solution and the exact solution of the model. So for us, in our case, the first order solution happens to be very good. So the GDP growth are about 99.99% correlated with the exact solution.
Okay, any other questions?
Hi, this is Zhenya. I have a quick one. I wonder if you could also say something about the relative contribution of correlations across countries versus the correlation across sectors. Is this something you have also explored under this framework?
So, I mean, we are starting with sectoral shocks. So you're talking about whether it's important to have within country cross-sector correlation versus the same sector across countries? Is that?
Yeah, exactly. Or there's like a third term, which is, having both at the same time. Given your key message is that the correlated shocks are the first order driver of international correlation. So I guess you could also see if you can decompose this at the country level versus at the sectoral level.
So I would, everything is at the sector level, right? So what we could do is something that is more like within the country across sectors, same sector across countries, and then across countries, different sectors, right? This would be, so what we have done in terms of sectors is just look at the correlation of certain sectors like financial. We've done a sectoral version of our decomposition, and then we've looked really at, whether any particular sector is very important for Comovement. That is going to come both because of its correlation with the same set in other countries and with its correlation within the country. We haven't done further decomposition than that, but there are other ways to slice this.
Right.
So just to add to this, I think you may be thinking about some kind of, if we have a panel of country sector level shocks, maybe thinking of like fitting some sort of like factor model or something with a country component and a global sector component. And so, I think mechanically what's going to happen is that cross-sectoral correlations are going to account for way more of the GDP correlation than within sector correlation, right? So if I add the correlation of, the machinery sector in one country with the machinery sector with another country, plus the apparel sector with apparel and so on, those same sector correlations are going to account for a minority of the overall correlation. Just because the off-diagonal terms, the cross-sectoral correlation, where machinery in one sector with apparel in the other sector, there's just way more of them. And in absence huge discrepancies between within versus cross-sector correlations, which I don't think we have here, mechanically is going to be the cross-sectoral correlations that are going to account for a majority of the overall, from an accounting perspective. But maybe we should think about how to make that systematic.
Right. Yeah, you can see a little bit of that in that heat map of the shock correlation across countries and sectors, right? It was all over the place, and then there's way more. I guess Andre's point is there's way more that is just off the diagonal. So mechanically, it's going to be more abundant.